So I guess it's probably a reflection of, like, very few patients get affected, and therefore few people want to hear about it. So I guess that's kind of goes with the flow. And orphan audience, exactly, exactly. Yeah, there you go, there you go. And this is actually interesting. I'm hoping that Google Glass will replace both this together with something one device. So thank you. Thanks for coming back. Going to walk you through the introduction, the presentation objectives, share with you some of the policies that are currently in place for rare disease in this region, country by country basis. Walk you through some of the so-called successes in both the public and the private systems in these countries, and where the direction would be, just a kind of an educated guess around the policy changes, not just in Latin America but also globally across the rare disease space. The policy landscape for orphan, or sometimes what is also called the ultra orphan therapies. We're going to help you understand in some of the key markets like Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina. Provide an overview and challenges faced by the orphan drug manufacturers, and I think that's a critical aspect because it affects so small number of patients. It poses a lot of challenges from the development perspective, and therefore the valuation of the molecules, the usual NPVs internally, and therefore the price. And then some of the viable solutions that may enhance the pricing and reimbursement process, which predominantly revolves around earlier engagement with the payers, building a set of KOLs in the market, so on and so forth. So it does, we know by definition, it affects a very, very small percentage of the population, and that's how orphan drugs are defined, or rare disease. But what it from the manufacturer perspective, it poses certain kinds of challenges that are not being seen in sort of the other non-orphan products. The first and foremost is definitely the decreased incentives for research and development due to low patient numbers. So when you think even for smaller oncology molecules which are non-orphan, definitely forget about the cardiovascular or primary care kind of diseases. So when it comes to epidemiology of the disease, these numbers are really, especially in this region, you'd be lucky if you have 5 patients per country. So what is the incentive for a manufacturer who is looking at it more from a global perspective to even think of bringing this kind of product in the market? And definitely from a from a clinical trial perspective, clinical development perspective, you can never have those multi-country trials that regulatory agencies like the FDA, EMA, or Anvisa are used to see for most of the molecules that they evaluate. Sites sometimes are like maybe 10 sites all over the world because of the lower number of patient population, and more importantly because of the lower awareness of the disease in those countries. So what it does is you still have to meet certain primary endpoints in your trials. So for a small patient in a smaller number of sites, your trial could get sometimes long enough in order to meet those primary endpoints just from a pure statistical perspective. So what it does is it does increase the development cost, and it also affects the length of the time that it takes in order to finish one trial, whether it's phase 2 or even phase 3. And very, very low number of trained professionals that can make the R&D planning process challenging. Not only, and it's a reflection of number of KOLs that exist who has seen this kind of patients, and therefore if that is very small, you can only imagine how smaller the number of medical or clinical development colleagues would be inside the manufacturers, inside the company, who have actually a very both the length and breadth of the knowledge of this kind of rare disease. Some of them who are currently in the medical organizations, they were not exposed during their medical school curriculum. So that creates an inherent challenge of even developing a full-blown clinical development as well as R&D initiatives around these diseases. It's changing. I think the recognition and awareness of some of these diseases are coming much more mainstream. And I think the patient advocacy groups and approvals and access of orphan drugs is helping a lot in those directions. From a pricing and reimbursement perspective, the lack of appropriate active comparator. And this, again, the regulatory, the reimbursement agencies always evaluate these products based on their internal benchmark of bigger products that affect larger number of patient population with a very established standard of care or an active comparator. In a lot of those cases, this could actually be an open label study. And that's where some of the challenges come from a clinical trial design perspective. And also a lot of uncertainty when the total number of patients that you have is sometimes just less than 50 patients. So for a regulatory agency to approve a trial based on 50 patients, sometimes just one trial, that too without an active comparator, without the knowledge of standard of care that currently exists, it just creates increasing problems from both from the registration as well as the pricing and reimbursement perspective. And demonstrating cost effectiveness, we talked about it during the previous discussion. Orphan drugs, by definition, will never be cost effective. That's why they're orphan. They're going to affect a very, very small number of population. And even in 4 or 5 years with appropriate market development and awareness, they will probably still remain orphan. And that's why that is one fundamental aspect that the traditional health economic approach of demonstrating cost effectiveness is just irrelevant in the orphan drugs. And I think the budget impact has some discussion, some value with discussing with the payers and the stakeholders. But again, there you're talking about very small number of patients with an epidemiology that is very not well established in all the countries. And last but not least is that the accelerated approval due to the unmet need is sometimes creates a problem for decreased clinical evidence as launch. Your go-to-market strategy, in most cases, with just one study that has 50 or less patients. So the amount of evidence that your KOLs, payers, regulators, everyone is used to see of different kinds of products, those will be completely absent at the time of launch. So these are some of the inherent challenges, but also there are some opportunities in terms of bringing a product or a set of products that has well-defined unmet need in the population, and that's probably where the opportunity for some of the manufacturers come in, despite the challenges that we have just described. So obviously, I think from a policy and healthcare financing mechanism perspective, there is one fundamental question, that to what extent the policy should dictate the orphan drug registration and reimbursement. And it's not whether there is a need for a different policy, but how those policy could be developed quickly enough and rapidly communicated enough to the manufacturers so that there is an incentive to bring more and more orphan drugs into the market. And obviously, the level of evidence supporting the differences between orphan and non-orphan drugs needs to be very clearly articulated to all the stakeholders. In terms of the overview and some of the country-specific policy initiative, and this is just a little bit of a built-in slide. So, in 1983, US had the first orphan drug act that was passed by FDA, followed by Japan, even though considerably later, 10 years later, with the Ministry of Health, Labor and Labor Welfare, followed by Canada, Australia, and China came into the market relatively early, at least from a policy perspective, and then followed by the EMA Regulation 141, which happened during the turn of the century, in terms of defining what orphan disease is, what rare disease and orphan drugs are, and coming out with a policy across the European Union. What we have noticed is that almost, even it took another 10 years within this region, first started by Colombia, which was approved by the Congress in 2010, but that immediately kind of generated a lot of interest in other markets in order for the policy approvals. In Mexico, 2012, Argentina also in the same year, and what we just heard about the Colombian decision of moving it forward. But there are still a lot of other countries, both in and outside this region, from a global perspective, that are still in the process of literally defining the orphan drug definition and the supporting policy that would encourage this kind of products to come to the market. China is still under the review of the People's National Congress. They originally started with 2 provisions of the rare disease, but they're trying to consolidate both of them into one. And in Chile, in September 2011, a bill was drafted and is currently awaiting approval in the Congress, to the best of our knowledge at this point. And since 2010, the recognition of the rare disease and definition of this within Latin American countries have become more of a significant priority. And this kind of corroborates on the other aspects in the market. A lot of the orphan drugs have got launched, and some kind of access were obtained since these policies were approved. In terms of the evolution in Latin America, we just kind of focus into three countries for the rest of the presentation: Argentina, Mexico, and Brazil. And you can see the color codes here. The distinction in the pricing and reimbursement process, even in the more or less a relatively advanced country in Brazil, is still under discussion. Whereas the orphan disease recognition is definitely there in Argentina and Mexico, and in Brazil, at least to the public system, there is a recognition of some of the diseases. And we were talking during the previous discussion how SUS has recognized some of these diseases, and some public funding is available for areas like Gaucher disease. So in Brazil, initial drafts of documents in the development of the rare disease treatment approach. It's a policy still under discussion with a lot of the internal stakeholders, as well as a reference to other developed market policies. But at this point, the patient's access or the market access of the product is still limited, but it's available through the legal injunctions, as is therapies are rarely financed through the SUS, except for the Gaucher disease example. In Mexico, the first definition of the orphan drug was established in 2011, and the legislation was drafted that all Mexican citizens have a right to access to the orphan therapies. This new recognition is expected to lead to greater access for patients with rare disease. But those of you who are familiar with the Mexican system very well, there is a lot of registration and the regulatory approval happens, but the subsequent broader access to the product, even those are non-orphans, remain substantially challenging. And last but not least, in Argentina, adopted a definition of the rare disease. The recent resolution in 2012 provides a means of risk redistribution, which was sort of the premise of the policy approval. And we are seeing a little bit of movement in terms of the market access for a lot of the products. If we look now a little bit closer into this three markets, you can see the evolution of the law and the subsequent availability of the products. The Gaucher and Fabry disease are probably the two immediate orphan drugs that or two rare disease areas that probably created most of the discussion around orphan drugs, approval and access. And so, nevertheless, it's not unusual to see that various orphan therapies were approved for inclusion in the Cuadro Básico, and they, at this point, they're still covering, some of these orphans as well as the ultra orphans. And this is just, some of these, just the products. When you look a little bit, different in Argentina, just from a policy perspective, and just to keep this in mind how the markets are developing in this aspect. Prior to 2012, the high-cost drugs for rare disease were generally obtained through compassionate use programs or through the judicialization process, since access to healthcare is considered as a constitutional right. But in August of 2012, there are a lot of the activities happen in addition to highlighting what are the requisites of granting status as an orphan in Argentina. And last but not least, which led the actual, from the premise of the risk redistribution of the high-cost products, finally a policy became effective in Argentina. And when you look at Brazil, it's still in the in work in progress from a policy perspective. And before January 2012, there were only about 11 rare diseases that were included in the SUS protocols. And post January 12, when Conitec decisions for orphan drugs, and they started reviewing orphan drugs, more actively than before. And then continuing into about a year and a half later, there has been some public consultation of rare disease, both from the registration as well as from the evaluation perspective. I know someone had an earlier question about how how the private payers are reacting to the orphan drugs in Brazil, because Conitec's evaluations are given some importance even in the private sector. So that sometimes creates a challenge where the cost effectiveness or the economic efficiency of these products may not always be well accepted based on our standard thresholds of cost effectiveness or similar norms. So that's, I think this is where the separation of evaluation of the orphan drugs and the other drugs will become very, very useful, both from a policy as well as from an access perspective. In terms of the not necessarily a full-blown success story all the time, but when we looked at all these molecules that are available in some or all of these three markets, as part of almost a case study approach to orphan drug access, we are going to, in the next few slides, going to review some of the financing mechanisms around some of these products in this entire basket. So let's start with Brazil. The assessment type is definitely therapeutic area prioritization. Is this important? What is the kind of unmet need for this patient population in the market? The cost effectiveness and the budget impact. As you can see, this is definitely almost the beginning of the end when you introduce the parameter of cost effectiveness in orphan disease evaluation. So when you look at all the products that are currently available, and how both SUS and NS kind of cover some of these products from an access perspective. Almost all rare diseases are registered with ANVISA that require the use of the orphan drugs. They remain outside of SUS, and which represents a considerable barrier for any kind of public patients wishing to access this kind of agents or treatments. Only Gaucher therapies have succeeded in gaining public financing. And if you think of when Gaucher disease and the products came to the market, you could see a considerable time lag between the market authorization and getting public access. Some of the implications, the SUS does not provide too much of the exceptions on the orphan drugs, and that is a considerable challenge and almost a lack of incentives. The manufacturer can, in some way, should pursue, the state financing, but probably will not be successful in all of them, and also focus on the private financing, and that's one area with a lot of the emergence of the private insurance. This opens up an opportunity, especially with a limited budget impact, and in this case, it will really be limited because the epidemiology of the disease will support the case that the patient population is not going to grow 3, 4, 5 times. Which sometimes is the concern for a lot of these authorities. So there is, there is some kind of TA prioritization by the public system, but the lack of separation of the evaluation criteria probably poses the biggest challenge, and that's why it's still kind of a work in progress in Brazil in order to make that distinction happen. So in the recent decisions from Conitec, that no special economic evidence concessions are made for ultra-orphan therapies, which is probably both from a policy as well as from an access challenge. And you could see some of the positive and the negative decisions that have been made. Even when the positive decision was made, there was associated price cut for this particular molecule. And a lot of the negative decisions that Conitec has used are probably evaluating within the similar context of the other therapies. For SUS funding, based on some of the cases that we have noticed through working with various clients, is discounting would be required, and especially if there are at least some kind of a treatment alternatives available. And that's also sort of the evolution of the orphan drug and the rare disease that is happening almost globally. What was considered even for the first 3-4 years after launch as the only possible drug available for a particular rare condition, now suddenly you are seeing that there are alternatives that are also coming to the market. So which means that those evaluation with against an active comparator sometimes might actually poses a challenge from a clinical development and as well as from the evidence perspective as this market or some of these therapeutic areas grow. If you think of Gaucher disease, there are a lot of companies that are currently have products in development in that. So when those new products come to the market, inevitably the payers and the registration authorities will look for head-to-head comparative data. Especially with a very small population, having head-to-head data in rare disease will definitely pose a tremendous amount of challenge, both from the clinical development, clinical trial design perspective, but also from pricing and access perspective. Because then it will start looking like a non-orphan evaluation criteria of the active comparator standard of care, which may be absent in a lot of countries at this point. And I think the other aspect is definitely sometimes the pricing flexibility may not always be possible, because if you're looking for a smaller volume of patients, you are inevitably looking for a higher price tag just from a pure revenue perspective, and therefore looking for alternative funding opportunities, maybe opportunity for working with a private foundation and or patient advocacy groups which are sometimes funded to some extent with treatment options, in the sense that patients can obtain a certain part of the treatments by working through the advocacy group or the foundation. Could also be utilized as alternative financing mechanism. In Mexico, the assessment type is probably not unexpected. It's relatively non-transparent. Although there is some kind of TA prioritization that happens both from the registration as well as from the disease prioritization perspective. You can see that the enzyme replacement therapy agents were included in IMSS and ISTE 1 to 3 years post-launch. And also the manufacturers often require to submit the pharmacoeconomic dossiers for these agents to CSG. So in some cases, you will notice that there are some traditional requirements of the evidence, as pharmacoeconomic dossiers. But to what extent those are actually utilized for formal decision making, especially in rare disease area, is always a question. And when you look at how IMSS and ISTE and Seguro Popular have evaluated these products, a lot of them are not financed, especially that have come in the recent months. But a lot of them are also financed in Mexico, especially in some of the selected enzyme replacement therapies that have been launched recently. And I think one critical point to note here that the time, there is always a substantial time gap between the marketing authorization and obtaining access in any of these systems in Mexico. But I think for the broader coverage through Seguro Popular, you need some kind of an extensive and consistent advocacy around the product in order for subsequent inclusion. So that 1 to 3 year of time lag is something that needs to be incorporated into your business planning, so that just an immediate marketing authorization and obtaining the code number for the product does not always translate into an access opportunity in Mexico. So that's sort of the in this case 1 to 3 years post launch is probably has happened much faster, but in most cases it might take a much longer time. For the non-enzyme replacement therapies and orphan agents, it's still kind of sporadic across the IMSS and Seguro Popular. And as you can see, this is a much more red, which means these are not financed, and only few of these products are actually financed, and some of them are not even launched yet in Mexico, at least based on last information. The CSG process is the main challenge for the other type of orphans, which are not enzyme replacement therapies. And again, I think this is becoming almost a strategy of how to involve the patient advocacy groups and continue with a very, very consistent advocacy strategy that would be most useful in order to at least generate the awareness and hopefully a subsequent access for these products. Looking at Argentina, in December 2012, they passed a law of providing some of these enzyme replacement therapy orphan products on an emergency basis. If we look into through the PMO, it's still not financed. It's a very, very sporadic in terms of its availability through the broader patient population. Only selected agents have received the emerging funding, although multiple options per disease appear to be funded. In terms of the implication aspect is that it's still financing likes to encounter some of the barriers. Even there are some financing pathway that has been established, but as you can see, the coverage of these products is still very, very limited. And in the last at least 6 to 8 months of time, we haven't seen much of movement in terms of moving any of this red into the green area. For continuing with Argentina, for the non-enzyme replacement therapy, it's a slightly better picture, but not necessarily a very rosy picture, nevertheless. Selected agents have received this funding. They are still subject to very, very strict monitoring and prior authorization, as well as a registration of the price. This is basically the way to restrict utilization and kind of holding the manufacturers to the number of patients that they almost have promised is not going to exceed. The financing is likely to incur some barriers, as we have seen with even with some of the private market opportunities in Argentina, we haven't seen much of the movements here. So I think from the 3 countries as we have just looked into, there are some emerging success stories that are coming for some of the products. It definitely driven by the unmet need, the number of patients, and also the extent of advocacy and the patient level engagement that is a very, very critical aspect in these countries, probably in this region, in order to gain access for these orphan drugs. And specifically in Brazil, the public system access is challenging. But if you can help the public financing authorities understand the prioritization of some of these rare diseases in their minds, there is obviously one way of bringing the process a little bit faster. And I think that's probably where the Gaucher disease and the manufacturers have been successful, but it does take time. And I think the other aspect is that pricing flexibility is required. Despite this smaller patient volume and therefore expected higher price tag, you'd expect that especially if there is some kind of a treatment alternatives exist, which could be seen as a standard of care in the local market itself, then the pricing flexibility becomes very, very critical in order to get the healthcare financing. For Mexico, for Mexico, the orphan drugs within the specific areas have much more positive access outlook, especially if you look at the IMSS and Seguro Popular. But the consistent advocacy is something that is required probably across most of the high-value therapies in Mexico, without which it is very difficult to obtain a broader access. And last but not least, in Argentina, there is a relatively generous program to multiple treatment options, but they are going to provide a lot of restrictions on the utilization. And sometimes it is not unusual that some of the payers in Argentina have actually used the exact inclusion-exclusion criteria from the clinical trial to find the patients and restrict utilizations. So that because they refer to that as almost a threshold of how to make the products available to the patient population or not. In terms of the the last section is and looking a little bit of a broader perspective coming out of the region into how these some of the other countries are looking at orphan drugs and the policy aspect as well. The recognition of orphan drugs is relatively uniform in the sense there is, from epidemiological perspective, whether 1 per 20,000 or 5 per 100,000 is a normal definition that has been used. So from that perspective, almost every major country across the region as well as the world have some recognition of the orphan drugs, and the fact that so many are coming out every year. In fact, last year's FDA approvals, more than 50% of FDA approvals last year were for orphan therapies. So if you just extrapolate that, those products trying to come out into other markets, you could easily see that to what extent initial recognition is almost critical. But a distinction in the pricing and reimbursement process, especially the challenges we spoke at the very beginning of the presentation of the smaller patient population in the clinical trial, the challenge for showing orphan drugs being really cost effective in any threshold, not just the UK's threshold, but also across the countries. And last but not least, sometimes there is no active comparator in the clinical trial because there is no standard of care that is currently available. So open label study, small population, low cost, cost effectiveness is a very beyond the threshold, sometimes 8-10 times more than the thresholds that most countries are familiar with. So from a methodological challenges, they do poses, and that's why I think unless there is a distinction in the pricing and reimbursement evaluation and the evidence expectation process from a policy perspective, it will be very, very difficult to prove orphan drugs being cost effective. In terms of and that we just highlighted in Scotland and Poland, even though there are sometimes funding available, but the evaluation process sometimes makes it very, very challenging. And when you look at Japan, it does not have a distinct PRN process, but their current system does not tend to impede access to orphan disease because it still kind of evaluates the clinical efficacy of the product, and not yet in a formal HTA way, but although there is a movement going on in Japan towards a broader HTA evolution in the market itself. And in Germany, they are permitted to submit a reduced dossier in their AMNOG reimbursement submissions. So they have definitely taken a little bit more progressive and proactive step in terms of understanding and actually enforcing that the evidence requirement for orphan drugs is going to be very, very different and separate compared to the other therapies. In Germany and France, so we evaluated some of the products that fall under the orphan definition. They are oncology, some are oncology products included as well. And France has given an ASMR rating of 3 to a product like Cetris, but Germany has said there is non-quantifiable benefit of that product. And well as if you look at some of the more traditional, the HTA decisions, even in a market like Scotland, there are no concessions in the pricing and reimbursement process for the orphan drugs, and therefore the continuous struggle to get a positive reimbursement decision still persists. And in terms of the evolution, I think this is where we see, if you look at the decreasing decision transparency, so that the manufacturers do not have much idea of how the decisions are being made, so that going this way, and over the horizontal axis is the pricing and reimbursement concessions from the methodological or from the request for evidence perspective for the orphan agents. We almost see that maybe Brazil has to make a sort of gradually shift from a policy perspective towards this in terms of the transparency of the decision making, whereas for Argentina and Mexico, where the decision process is still not well established or well transparent, but we would expect that a fewer PNR concessions in terms of the evidence requirements would probably a very, very positive direction for the manufacturers to find incentives to bring more drugs in these countries. And in Argentina, if HTA gains any kind of more traction for reimbursement decisions, I think again the separation of the methodological request, separation of the evidence for orphan versus non-orphans is something that would be critical, and I'm sure Hector will have comments about that. In terms of the key findings, the countries where the evaluation process heavily relies on the cost effectiveness ratio or cost effectiveness analysis, it will remain a challenge, especially if the anchoring on a particular threshold is being done or is being well articulated for all other therapies. Orphan drugs will never be able to match those numbers. It's only in instances where they have been able to forego the required cost effectiveness threshold have been positively recommended for reimbursement, as we have seen for Kalydeco in UK. And that also includes a lot of the engagement prior to submission of the information. And that is sort of a part of the process where, in order to be able to convince the real unmet need for some of these products, you probably have to be in front of the payers much early and not just 6 months before the marketing authorization happens. I think in terms of the is more heavily focused in markets such as in France and Germany, where their mindset has been predominantly on comparative effectiveness. In a lot of cases, there is no comparison. There is no comparator in a lot of the orphan disease studies. So in those situations, I think if there is a robust evidence to show the improvement in patients from baseline to the end of the treatment, I think that would provide a lot more assurance to this kind of countries or systems where they have traditionally focused on more of the clinical efficacy of the product and not necessarily the cost effectiveness. And in the emerging markets, I think the competing priorities are there. Most of the emerging market countries have not been able to manage cardiovascular disease yet. So to expect to put orphan disease in their priority is going to be challenging. But there are also a lot of the engagement, patient advocacy, as well as truly identifying the unmet need in their patient population is going to be critical. So just because there are 15 patients in Brazil, there could be only 2 patients in Argentina, there could be just 1 patient in Venezuela. It doesn't mean that you have to launch that product in every country. And I think this is where a little bit of the more of the portfolio prioritization, not from what needs to be developed, but I think a portfolio prioritization from the standpoint of what could be launched in a commercially profitable way versus not launching it at all. And there are ways, mechanisms in most of these countries with early access program, or just continue to have the compassionate use program where patients, those 2 or 3 patients in small countries can still have availability to the product. But going to a formal registration and then not having reimbursement only for 2 patients in the country is probably a decision that needs to be made after considering a lot of other aspects. But orphan disease from other perspectives, and I think probably this is something Eric might agree, that it creates a tremendous amount of corporate reputation value in the market. That even for a very small number of patient population, a manufacturer is willing to bring a product which is not very easy to make it go through the development process. It still costs a sufficient amount of time, money, and resources to bring this product in the market, but it creates that halo effect in the market about the manufacturer who are willing to put a product out even though the revenue upside may not be significant. And in terms of the approach to improve access, I think from a manufacturer perspective, I think no matter what, just the mindset of the payers and regulators is such that they always ask about budget impact and cost effectiveness, because those are the questions that they're always used to asking the manufacturers irrespective of the product. And therefore, early involvement of HEOR activity, sometimes even putting out publications how orphan drugs can never be cost effective. Even those kind of messages being out in the public domain is very, very helpful. in order to build the market, especially in the minds of the payers, please, that they should not expect a cost effectiveness threshold that they used to see for other products. Post-approval commitment, this is not a regulatory commitment from agencies, but this is more like if the orphan drug is restricted by based on utilization, then that is also considered as a post-approval commitment to the payers, that whatever has been promised in the first 2 years is maintained at that number of patients. And obviously the early engagement of the payer authorities, and I think every payer is learning through this the whole rare disease orphan drug registration and access process almost as we speak. They're learning from each other quite fast. So from a manufacturer perspective, if you are not in front of the payers 6 months or 1 year before the launch of the product, they will hear something about your product from someone else, and they will definitely hear the countries that are not ready to pay for the product. So they will always use that as an example in order to challenge your value proposition of the product, and therefore an early, at least 1 year prior to launch would be very, very critical. And from a government policy perspective, I think this is easy to probably understand, but I know policy cycles are always much longer than business cycles. But the reality is that there has to be a policy difference between requirements for orphan drugs and requirements for non-orphan drugs. Unless that happens clearly and it's not well articulated, these rare disease products will be very, very difficult to launch in most of the countries in this region, and it's probably in most of the emerging market countries across the world. And I think the creative reimbursement agreements, although we started seeing a little bit of risk sharing in the orphan disease area, but that all depends on what kind of primary endpoint was used in the clinical trial, because you have just one study, maybe 2 studies if someone is extremely lucky. So for a one study to have a risk sharing arrangement, you almost have to replicate your clinical trial experience in the real world in order to make a risk sharing kind of agreement happen. And but one thing that is happening very, very more often than the others is the patient registries for rare diseases. And that's where you have the access to the real world data, that where you have access to the historical data. And a lot of the patient advocacy and KOLs are actually heavily involved in tracking this rare disease patients through local patient registries. And sometimes the volume of patients in these registries are a good way to make the case to the payers of allocating certain funds, whether it's a public or private, in rare disease. So with that, I'm going to close my presentation, and Monica just stepped out. She and Miguel, who is sitting there, are our colleagues in CBPartners, and I could not help but at least let you know what CBPartners does. And we are in pricing, market access, government policy advisory, which we are doing largely in a lot of emerging market countries, value demonstration, and also a lot of the commercial planning and portfolio prioritization work. For more details about any one of this, feel free to talk to me or my colleagues. Thank you very much. I hope I'm on time and ready for questions.
So thanks a lot. It was very interesting. Perhaps just one comment about the UK or England and Scotland. It seems that they are slowly learning from their mistakes and changing their approach to evaluation of orphan drugs. But I did some work last year on orphan drugs in Latin America, and talking to payers and people in the industry, they were saying that most of the patients are currently having access through suing their payers. And talking to then payers, they were saying, well, the companies are not even coming to me to negotiate the price anymore. This was in Argentina. They're just like targeting straight away the patient and paying for the lawyers and so on. And then to another payer that I spoke, he was saying, well, this is a good timing because I'm just about to go to a conference in which a bunch of payers across Latin America are going to get together and discuss about this issue. And I was wondering whether you have any sort of updates on what's happening with this, which I believe was a very hot topic at least like a year or 2 years ago.
Uh, to your first question about the litigation route of access, yes, it is happening, but the sustainability of that access strategy is always questionable. How long can you sustain getting access by suing people? And I think in rare disease, you could say, well, there are only 15 patients, so they can, have 5 lawyers working for all of them to get the product. But at some point, the policymakers will have to decide on the access to these orphan or orphan drugs. In some cases, the dialogue is happening because there are a lot of manufacturers that are really operating only in the orphan area. They do not have molecules for 2 million patients. So they are probably taking a more active role in engaging at the government policy level. But having countries like UK and Scotland having their own problems and their own very sort of short-sighted criteria is not helping the smaller countries, because they are constantly citing, if UK can do it, why are you asking me to change my policy? It's a matter of time. I mean, I think everyone has gone through HIV 10 years back to the same kind of arguments, and other diseases over the last 5 or 10 years. It's just a matter of time. And in terms of the pair coming together to understand what can be done or what cannot be done, I think that is happening everywhere. I think they are getting more information about the products and access status than the manufacturers are actually willing to share. So that's not going to. I would almost say that it's a good movement from the payer side, from a rare disease perspective. It may not be the same for other products, because then the net price information gets disclosed very quickly. But from a rare disease side, I think bringing the payers together is probably one way of extending the process to get broader access.
Sandeep, thank you for your presentation. It's just more than more comments to collaborate with the discussion. I'm not actually working specifically in rare disease, but in 2012, the government, MOH in Brazil, they have set a working group to develop a rare disease national policy. In 13, Interpharma was called, or we get involved with this discussion. And we had a couple of meetings, and even academic people were invited to contribute to this discussion of a different way of doing HTA process. Clarice Petramali, the director of Conitec at that time, was present in this discussion. And early this year, as I know, it was published, the national policy. I was even retrieving here, national policy for integral or integrated care of patients with hair disease. It covers from setting the services, giving attending this kind of patients, to use the definition of what would be hair disease, how to classify them, and based on this, there were specific fundings for handling these patients. I believe that it was a huge step in setting, and since this was a national policy published by the Ministry of Health, so it's a federal government, there are a lot of other policies being discussed by the Congress, other states Congress, but all of them were overcome, as I understand this, by this national policy, and this is supposed now to be spread across the country. And I believe that this policy set, since they have used many of WH concepts, they have set a new standard for understanding and handling the disease here in Brazil.